I'm Alicia Johnson, 34 years old. And 6 months ago my husband died in a car accident that shattered everything I thought I knew about family. The grief was suffocating, like trying to breathe underwater, but what my mother-in-law did next was even worse. If you've ever felt like an outsider in your own family, please let me know where you're watching from and subscribe to join others who understand this particular kind of heartbreak. I met David at a farmer's market on a crisp October morning in 2018. I was 27, working as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm and religiously hitting up the Saturday market for my weekly dose of overpriced organic vegetables and artisanal coffee. He was manning a booth for his family's apple orchard, sleeves rolled up despite the chill, explaining the difference between Honeycrisp and Gala apples to a confused elderly man with the patience of a kindergarten teacher. What caught me first wasn't his easy smile or the way his dark hair caught the morning light. It was how he listened, really listened. When the old man wandered off with his bag of apples, David turned to me with flour still dusting his apron and asked what I was looking for. Not what I wanted to buy, but what I was looking for. Something in his tone made me answer honestly. Something that feels like home. He handed me a warm apple cider donut and said, "Well, these are a good start." That donut was perfect, crispy outside, tender inside, with just enough cinnamon to make my eyes water in the cold air. We talked until his booth sold out, about everything and nothing. He told me about growing up on the orchard, how his grandfather had planted the first trees in 1952, how he dropped out of law school to save the family business when his dad got sick. I told him about my design work, my tiny apartment with the broken radiator, my dream of freelancing someday. When he asked for my number, I was already planning our second conversation. Those first 5 years together felt like we were building something solid and real from the ground up. David's orchard became profitable again under his management. He'd modernized their marketing, created an online store and turned their fall festivals into events that drew families from 3 counties. I started freelancing part-time, then full-time, building a client base that let me work from anywhere. We moved in together after 8 months, into a renovated farmhouse on the orchard property that smelled like wood polish and possibility. Our mornings started with coffee on the wraparound porch, planning the day while watching the sun come up over the apple trees. David had this ritual of checking the weather on 3 different apps, then stepping outside to feel what the day really had planned. I'd tease him about his meteorological paranoia, but secretly loved how seriously he took caring for something that had been trusted to him. We developed our own language of inside jokes and shorthand conversations. Thursday nights were sacred homemade pizza and terrible horror movies, with David providing running commentary about the plot holes while I sketched logo ideas in my notebook. When we traveled, he'd always pack trail mix with extra cashews because he knew they were my favorite, and I'd research local coffee shops because his perfect day started with a perfect cup of coffee. He proposed on the same bench where we'd had our first real conversation at the farmer's market, 3 years to the day after we met. The ring was his grandmother's, a simple solitaire that caught the afternoon light, like it had been waiting decades to shine again. The peak of our happiness lasted from our wedding in May 2022 until that gray February morning when everything ended. Our daily routine had become this beautiful dance of 2 people who genuinely liked each other's company. I'd wake up first, start the coffee and work on client projects in the kitchen while David did his morning orchard walk, checking for storm damage or signs of disease in the trees. He'd return with updates about which sections needed attention and stories about the wildlife he'd encountered, the family of deer that had claimed the north pasture, the red-tailed hawk that dive-bombed anyone who got too close to her nest. We'd eat lunch together most days, usually soup and sandwiches at the kitchen table while planning weekend adventures or discussing client projects. Evenings were for cooking together. David was surprisingly good with a knife, and I'd learned to make his grandmother's apple butter recipe that involved standing over a slow-simmering pot for hours. We'd talked about expanding the house, maybe adding a studio space where I could meet clients. We'd planned to travel to Ireland the following summer to visit the region where his great-grandfather had emigrated from. The future felt solid, mapped out in shared dreams and practical plans. I'd never felt so secure, so completely known and accepted by another person. When people talked about soulmates, I finally understood what they meant. But looking back now, there were small signs that the foundation wasn't as solid as I'd believed. David's mother, Patricia, had a way of making comments that felt like compliments until you thought about them later. Alicia's so independent, she'd say at family dinners, her tone suggesting this was somehow unfortunate. David's always been attracted to women who don't need him. His sister Rebecca had her own version of this passive aggression, often forgetting to invite me to family events, then acting surprised when David showed up alone and confused. There were whispered conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, and a general sense that I was being evaluated against some standard I wasn't privy to. David always defended me, but in a way that felt like he was mediating between two equally reasonable parties, rather than protecting his wife from his family's subtle hostility. I convinced myself I was being oversensitive, that they just needed time to warm up to an outsider. After all, they'd known each other for decades, and I'd only been part of the picture for 5 years. The morning of February 15th started like every other Thursday. David left for his usual coffee run to Milford Cafe, the small place in town that roasted their own beans and made scones that were worth the 20-minute drive. He'd been going there every Thursday for years, a little ritual that gave him time to think and me time to work without distractions. He kissed me goodbye at 8:47 a.m. I remember checking my phone to see if I had time to finish a logo revision before our lunch plans. The last thing he said was pick the movie for tonight, but nothing with subtitles. I'm too tired to read and watch at the same time. I was deep into a client project when the doorbell rang at 11:23 a.m. I wasn't expecting anyone, and deliveries usually came to the side door near the driveway. Through the front window, I could see a police cruiser parked in our circular drive, and my stomach dropped in that way that happens when your body understands something your mind hasn't processed yet. Officer Martinez and Officer Chen stood on my porch, their faces wearing that careful neutrality that meant the worst possible news. "Mrs. Johnson, we need to speak with you about your husband David." The words that followed, black ice, guardrail, impact, no survivors, felt like they were happening to someone else. I remember nodding and asking appropriate questions, but it was like watching myself from outside my body. They stayed until David's sister Rebecca arrived, having been called by someone at the scene who found David's emergency contact information. Rebecca's first words weren't about David or my grief, they were, "Have you called his lawyer yet?" Even in shock, something about her tone felt wrong, urgent in a way that had nothing to do with funeral planning. My first instinct was to call Patricia, David's mother, who lived 40 minutes away in the house where David had grown up. She'd always been the family coordinator, the one who organized holidays and kept track of birthdays and anniversaries. If anyone would know what needed to be done, it would be Patricia. The phone rang 4 times before she answered, and I could hear the television in the background, some morning talk show discussing celebrity gossip. "Patricia, it's Alicia, something terrible has happened." I told her about the accident, about the police visit, about how David was gone. There was a long pause, long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then, well, I suppose we'll need to make arrangements. I'll call Father McKenna about the service. You should probably start gathering his important papers. Her tone was businesslike, almost detached, like we were discussing a changed dinner reservation, rather than her son's death. "The family will handle the funeral arrangements," she continued. "We know what David would have wanted." The phrase "the family" hit me like a separate blow. I was his wife, his next of kin, but somehow I wasn't included in the family that would be making decisions. When I tried to express my own thoughts about the service, she cut me off. "Alicia, I know you're upset, but David's father and I have been planning what we'd want for our children since they were born. We know what's appropriate." The conversation ended with her saying she'd be in touch about the details, leaving me sitting in my kitchen, surrounded by the lunch dishes David and I had planned to wash together that evening, feeling like a stranger in my own life. 3 days after the funeral, a service where I felt like a guest rather than the widow, Patricia called to inform me that the family needed to discuss practical matters. She suggested we meet at the Orchard House, which struck me as odd since it was my home too. But grief makes you compliant in strange ways, so I agreed. When I opened the door that Saturday afternoon, I found not just Patricia but Rebecca, David's uncle Jim and his cousin Mark, all seated around my dining room table like a board of directors. They'd brought manila folders and legal pads, and Patricia had made coffee in my kitchen without asking. "We need to talk about David's estate," Patricia began, sliding a folder across the table toward me. "There are some things you need to understand about the family business. The orchard," she explained, "had always been held in a family trust. David's will, which apparently he'd updated just 6 months before his death, left his share of the orchard to his nephews, Rebecca's twin boys, who were currently 8 years old. David always said he wanted to keep the land in the family bloodline. Patricia continued, watching my face carefully. I'm sure you understand. The house, she informed me, was part of the orchard property, which meant it would eventually need to be sold or transferred. We're not heartless, Rebecca added. We'll give you time to make other arrangements. Maybe 6 months to find something suitable. They spoke about me like I wasn't there, discussing my future living situation and the logistics of transitioning me out of the family business. When I finally found my voice to ask about David's personal assets, his truck, his savings account, the life insurance policy I thought existed, Patricia's expression hardened. Alicia, you have to understand that David's loyalty was always to his family legacy. Everything he built was about preserving what his grandfather started. The most devastating part wasn't the legal maneuvering or even the financial implications. It was the complete absence of acknowledgement that I had been David's family too, that I had loved him and built a life with him, that I deserved more than a 6-month eviction notice delivered by committee in my own dining room. The following week, I attended what I thought was a memorial gathering at the local community center. David's high school friends had organized it, wanting to share stories and celebrate his life in a more informal setting than the funeral had allowed. I arrived to find the parking lot full, and the main hall decorated with photos of David from every stage of his life. It felt good to see him remembered by people who had known different versions of him. The high school basketball player, the college student who came home every weekend to help with harvest, the adult who quietly paid for his former teacher's medical bills when she couldn't afford cancer treatment. I was standing near a display of photos from our wedding, talking to his friend Mike about David's terrible attempts at basketball trash talk. When I overheard Patricia talking to a group of family friends by the dessert table, "It's such a tragedy," she was saying, her voice carrying just enough to reach my ears. David was so young, with so much potential. If only he'd had children to carry on his legacy. Mrs. Henderson, who had taught David in 3rd grade, responded with confusion. But doesn't Alicia? Patricia's voice dropped slightly, but not enough. Well, you know how it is with second wives, they're just not invested in the family legacy the same way. Alicia's a lovely girl, but she was never really family. She'll probably move back to the city now that she doesn't have David keeping her here. I stood frozen, wedding photos blurring in front of me, as the full weight of how they saw me became clear. I hadn't been David's wife in their eyes, I'd been his temporary distraction, a phase he'd grown out of. When Mike noticed my expression and asked if I was okay, I realized I couldn't speak. The room felt too small, too full of people who had apparently been having conversations about my temporary status in David's life. I left through the side exit, walking past tables of David's favorite desserts and displays of his accomplishments, feeling like I was disappearing even while standing in a room full of people who claimed to have loved him. 2 weeks later, Patricia called to schedule what she termed a formal discussion about the estate settlement. This time the meeting was at the law office of Hamilton and Associates, the firm that had handled the family's legal matters for decades. I arrived to find not just the immediate family, but also David's Aunt Sarah and his godfather, Mr. Hamilton himself, presiding over the conference table like a judge. The will reading felt like a performance staged for my benefit, each clause delivered with theatrical precision. David's truck and tools went to his nephew. His savings account, which I discovered was much larger than I'd known, was divided between a trust for Rebecca's children and a donation to the orchard's operating fund. The life insurance policy I'd assumed would provide some financial security had been changed 6 months before his death, with the beneficiary listed as the Johnson Family Orchard Trust. When I asked about our joint checking account and the savings we'd built together for our Ireland trip, Patricia's lawyer, because apparently she had her own lawyer present, explained that since all our assets had been combined and since David's contributions to those accounts came from orchard profits, everything reverted to the family trust. David was always very clear about his priorities, Patricia said, her hands folded on the table. Family legacy came first. I'm sure he assumed you understood that. The most crushing moment came when they presented me with a document to sign, waiving any potential claims against the estate in exchange for being allowed to stay in the house for 6 months rent-free. It's really quite generous, Mr. Hamilton noted. Technically, as a non-family member, you'd have no claim to orchard property anyway. Rebecca added, with what she probably thought was kindness, and this way you'll have time to figure out your next steps without the pressure of immediate deadlines. They had clearly prepared for this moment, with lawyers and documents and reasonable-sounding justifications for why David's widow deserved nothing more than a 6-month grace period. When I asked to see David's original will, the one from before our marriage, the room went silent. Finally, Mr. Hamilton cleared his throat. "I'm afraid that's confidential family business, Mrs. Johnson. What matters is David's final wishes, which are very clear." The meeting ended with them sliding the waiver across the table and suggesting I take some time to think it over, though their tone implied that thinking wasn't really necessary, just signing. 1 month after that humiliating legal performance, I received a call from Rebecca that felt different from the others. Her voice had an edge of urgency that set off alarm bells immediately. "Alicia, we need to talk. Some issues have come up with the estate that require immediate attention." She suggested meeting at the local diner rather than at the Orchard or another family location, which seemed odd. When I arrived at Murphy's Diner, a place where David and I had eaten breakfast every Sunday morning for 5 years, Rebecca was already seated in a back booth, manila folder on the table and nervous energy radiating from her posture. "Look," she began without preamble, "there's been a complication. Mother didn't want me to tell you this, but I think you have a right to know." She slid a document across the table, a copy of David's original will, dated 3 years before his death. According to this version, I was the primary beneficiary of his life insurance, the house, and his personal assets. The Orchard shares were still designated for family, but everything else was mine. David updated his will 6 months before he died. Rebecca continued, "But there's a problem. The lawyer who handled the update is claiming David wasn't mentally competent when he signed it. Apparently he'd been on pain medication for his back injury around that time, and there are questions about whether he understood what he was signing." This was news to me. David had hurt his back helping a neighbor move the previous summer, but I didn't remember him being on any medication that would affect his judgment. Rebecca's next words made my blood run cold. "Mother thinks it would be easier for everyone if you just accepted the updated will without challenging it. She's prepared to increase your settlement to 12 months in the house instead of 6, plus a small cash payment for your trouble. But if you fight this, she's prepared to hire private investigators to look into your marriage, to prove that David was planning to leave you anyway." The threat was barely veiled: "Accept their terms or they'd destroy my reputation and David's memory in court." When I asked what evidence they could possibly have that David wanted to leave me, Rebecca looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Mother has been documenting things for a while. Conversations David had with her about feeling trapped, about wanting children and feeling pressured by you to wait, about missing his old life. None of this sounded like the David I'd known, but grief makes you doubt everything, including your own memories." Rebecca ended our meeting with what she probably thought was kindness. "Alicia, you're young and talented. You can build a new life anywhere. Why tie yourself to a place where you'll always be an outsider? Take the settlement and start fresh somewhere. People don't know you as David's widow." As I sat in that diner booth, surrounded by the smell of bacon and coffee that usually meant comfort, I realized they weren't just stealing David's assets, they were trying to rewrite the story of our entire marriage. The final escalation came 6 weeks later, when I returned from a grocery trip to find Patricia's car in my driveway, and Patricia herself sitting on my front porch like she owned the place. She wasn't alone. She'd brought David's Aunt Sarah and his cousin Jennifer, apparently for moral support or intimidation. "Alicia, we need to have a frank conversation," Patricia announced as I approached with my bags of groceries. "This situation has gone on long enough." Without being invited, they followed me into the house, taking seats in my living room while I put away milk and bread with hands that had started shaking. Patricia had brought more documents, this time, a formal eviction notice and a cease and desist letter, demanding I stop harassing the family by asking questions about David's will. "You've been calling lawyers," she accused, "asking inappropriate questions about family business. This has to stop." The truth was, I had consulted with an attorney, a friend of a friend, who specialized in estate law. He'd told me that David's will seemed legally valid, regardless of whether he'd been on pain medication, and that I had grounds to challenge the family's claims. He'd also mentioned that in our state, surviving spouses have certain rights that can't be easily dismissed, even with a will. Patricia's next move was truly devastating. She produced a folder full of printed emails between David and Rebecca from the months before his death. "Read these," she demanded, "and tell me David was happy in your marriage." The emails painted a picture of a man feeling pressured and trapped, complaining about my career ambitions and my reluctance to have children immediately. In one particularly painful exchange, David allegedly wrote, "Sometimes I feel like I married a stranger who's just playing house with my life." The emails felt like David's voice, but saying things he'd never said to me, expressing doubts he'd never shared. When I pointed out that the email addresses weren't ones I recognized as David's, Patricia dismissed my concerns. David had multiple email accounts for different purposes. "You didn't know everything about your husband, Alicia," but the final blow came when she handed me printed photographs. Pictures of David having lunch with a woman I didn't recognize, taken just weeks before his death. David was rebuilding his social connections. Patricia explained with false sympathy. He'd started spending time with Elena Morrison. "You remember her, she was his high school girlfriend who moved back to town last year. They'd been talking about the mistakes they'd made, the paths not taken." The photos showed David smiling in a way that looked genuine. Engaged in conversation with a pretty brunette who seemed to be hanging on his every word. Elena has been very discreet about her renewed friendship with David. Patricia continued, but she's willing to testify about his state of mind if this matter goes to court. David confided in her about his regrets, about feeling like he'd rushed into marriage with someone who didn't really understand his family obligations. As I stared at those photos, I felt the ground shifting beneath everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my husband, and my place in his life. The confrontation I'd been dreading and preparing for finally happened on a gray Saturday morning in late April, exactly 3 months after David's death. Patricia had called the night before, insisting we needed to settle this matter once and for all, and demanding I come to the family house, the sprawling Victorian where David had grown up, which always felt more like a museum than a home. When I arrived, I realized this wasn't going to be a private conversation. Cars lined the circular driveway. Rebecca's SUV, Uncle Jim's pickup, Aunt Sarah's sedan, and several others I didn't recognize. Through the front windows I could see people gathered in the formal living room. The one with the uncomfortable antique furniture that David had always joked was for looking, not sitting. I'd spent the previous week preparing for this moment in ways they couldn't have anticipated. The attorney I'd consulted, Mark Stevens, had done some investigating of his own after I'd shown him the suspicious emails and photographs. He'd found enough irregularities to suggest that at least some of the evidence against my marriage had been manufactured. More importantly, he'd located the original copy of David's will at the courthouse, along with documentation showing that David had been mentally competent when he'd updated it. The pain medication story was complete fiction. David's medical records showed no prescriptions for anything stronger than ibuprofen in the months before his death. I'd also made some phone calls of my own, reaching out to mutual friends and David's former colleagues to ask about his state of mind in those final weeks. The picture they painted was completely different from the one his family was trying to create. As I walked up the front steps of the Victorian, clutching a manila folder that contained my own surprise revelations, I could hear voices through the windows. Patricia orchestrating the meeting like a corporate board session. When Rebecca opened the door, her expression was triumphant, like she was welcoming me to my own execution. "Everyone's here," she announced, leading me into the living room where I found myself facing what looked like a tribunal. Patricia sat in the wingback chair that had belonged to David's grandmother, flanked by Uncle Jim and Aunt Sarah. Rebecca took her position by the fireplace, and 3 other people I didn't recognize sat on the sofa, presumably witnesses or additional legal support. "Alicia," Patricia began, her voice taking on the tone of a disappointed school principal, "we're here to end this unfortunate situation with dignity. We've prepared a final settlement offer that's more than generous, considering the circumstances." She gestured to Uncle Jim, who slid a document across the coffee table toward me. $60,000 and 8 months in the house, in exchange for your signature on a comprehensive waiver of any claims against David's estate. This is our final offer. The amount was probably intended to sound substantial, but considering David's life insurance alone was worth $300,000, it felt more like an insult than a settlement. "Before I respond to your offer," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded, "I think there are some things you all should know." I opened my manila folder and pulled out the first document, a certified copy of David's medical records from the previous year. David wasn't on any pain medication that would have affected his mental capacity when he updated his will. That story was completely fabricated. Patricia's expression didn't change, but I caught a flash of something, anger or maybe fear, in her eyes. Furthermore, I continued. Those emails you showed me aren't from any account David ever used. The email address patriciajohnsonfamily@gmail.com was created 3 days after David's death, and the metadata shows the messages were all composed on the same day, from the same computer. Rebecca's face went pale, and she glanced nervously at her mother. But my real surprise came next. I also had an interesting conversation with Elena Morrison, I said, watching Patricia's composure finally crack. You know the woman from the photographs? She was very confused about why someone would claim she'd been having lunch dates with David since she's been living in Seattle for the past 2 years, and only came back for David's funeral. Those photos were taken 6 years ago, during their brief reconnection after high school, long before David and I ever met. The silence in the room was deafening. I could see them all exchanging glances, realizing that their carefully constructed narrative was falling apart. Elena was quite upset to learn that her image had been used to suggest an affair that never happened. She's prepared to sign an affidavit, stating that she had no contact with David during his marriage to me. Uncle Jim was the first to speak, his voice defensive. Now hold on, Alicia. Even if there are some discrepancies in the details, the fundamental issue remains the same. David's final will was clear about his intentions for the family property. Actually, I replied, pulling out another document, that brings me to the most interesting discovery of all. This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the revelation that would change everything. When I had David's will examined by a forensic document analyst, we found something fascinating. The signature on the updated will, the one that supposedly gives everything to the family trust, isn't David's signature. It's a very good forgery, but it's not his writing. I slid a comparison document across the table, showing David's real signature next to the forged one. Apparently, whoever created this document didn't realize that David broke his right hand in 8th grade and had developed a very distinctive way of holding a pen. The forged signature doesn't show that adaptation. The room erupted. Rebecca started to protest. Uncle Jim demanded to know who I thought I was accusing. And Aunt Sarah muttered something about ungrateful outsiders. But Patricia just sat there, staring at the signature comparison with the expression of someone watching their house burn down. Finally, she looked up at me with something that might have been respect, if respect could be mixed with pure hatred. Even if that's true, she said slowly, you can't prove who created that document. It could have been anyone. Actually, I can prove it, I replied, pulling out my final piece of evidence. The forged will was notarized by Jennifer Walsh, who happens to be Rebecca's college roommate, and who notarized a signature without the signer being present. Which is illegal. Jennifer was very forthcoming when she realized she could face criminal charges for her role in document fraud. She's prepared to testify about who asked her to notarize a pre-signed document, and when that occurred. Rebecca looked like she was going to be sick, and Patricia's carefully maintained composure finally shattered completely. You little bitch, Patricia hissed, standing up so quickly her chair rocked back. You think you can come into this family and tear it apart with your accusations and your lawyers? David may have been fooled by your act, but we know what you really are. A gold digger who trapped a good man and now wants to profit from his death. Her mask had finally slipped completely, revealing the hatred that had been simmering underneath all the polite legal maneuvering. You were never family, Alicia. You were never anything more than a phase David was going through. He was planning to leave you before he died, and we all knew it. I stood up to face her, feeling something shift inside me, from grief and confusion to clarity and strength. The only thing David was planning to leave was this toxic family dynamic, I said, my voice carrying more authority than I'd ever heard from myself. He told me about the pressure you put on him. About how you made him feel guilty for building a life outside your control. He was planning to establish boundaries with all of you, not leave his marriage. I looked around the room at all of them. The aunts and uncles and cousins who had spent months trying to convince me I was nothing. But you know what the really sad part is? David loved you all anyway. Even though you treated his wife like a temporary inconvenience. Even though you never accepted that he was allowed to choose his own family. He would be heartbroken to see what you've done to his memory. The meeting ended with Patricia threatening legal action, Rebecca crying, and various family members storming out while muttering about lawyers and ungrateful widows. But as I walked out of that Victorian house for the last time, carrying my folder full of evidence and truth, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, the solid ground of knowing exactly where I stood. The immediate aftermath of that confrontation was swift and decisive. Within a week, Patricia's attorney contacted mine to discuss settlement options that looked very different from their previous offers. The forged will was quietly withdrawn, and David's original will, the one that actually reflected his wishes, was submitted for probate. The life insurance company, once they were informed about the document fraud, released the policy funds to me as the legitimate beneficiary. The joint accounts that had mysteriously become family assets were restored to my control, but the real victory wasn't financial. It was the phone calls I started receiving from David's friends and extended family members who had been told a very different version of events. Mike, David's best friend from high school, called to apologize for believing Patricia's stories about my gold-digging behavior. "I should have known better," he said. "David talked about you like you hung the moon. He was never happier than when he was with you." Mrs. Henderson, David's third-grade teacher, sent a card admitting she'd been influenced by Patricia's concerns about my character, but had realized none of it made sense given the David she'd known. One by one, people emerged from the fog of Patricia's manipulation to express support and share their real memories of David's happiness during our marriage. I decided to keep the orchard house, despite the painful memories and Patricia's prediction that I'd run back to the city. With the insurance money and David's actual savings, which were substantial, I was financially secure enough to maintain the property and continue his work with the apple trees. I hired a local farming consultant to help me learn what David had never had time to teach me, and slowly began to understand why this land had meant so much to him. The physical work of caring for the orchard became a form of grief therapy, connecting me to David's daily routines and the seasonal rhythms that had shaped his life. The family members who had participated in the fraud faced various consequences. Rebecca was investigated for insurance fraud and ended up pleading guilty to a misdemeanor charge, receiving probation and community service. Jennifer, the notary who had helped forge the will, lost her license and faced professional sanctions. Patricia escaped legal consequences, but lost something perhaps more valuable to her: her position as the family matriarch. Other relatives, disgusted by her behavior, began excluding her from family events and decisions. The isolation she had tried to impose on me became her own reality. 6 months later, I received an unexpected visitor. Rebecca appeared at my door on a rainy Thursday afternoon, looking smaller and older than I remembered. She'd brought a peace offering, a photo album of David's childhood that she thought I might want to have. "I owe you an apology," she said, sitting awkwardly in my living room. "Not just for the will thing, but for how we treated you from the beginning. Mom convinced us that you were going to take David away from the family. But the truth is, we were the ones who were pushing him away." She explained that David had been planning to have a serious conversation with Patricia about her treatment of me, and that his death had prevented him from setting the boundaries he'd needed to establish. "He really did love you," she said, before leaving. "More than I wanted to admit. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, too much damage had been done for that, but it was acknowledgement of the truth that had been buried under months of manipulation and lies. The healing process took much longer than the legal resolution. Grief doesn't follow courtroom schedules or settlement timelines. Some days I felt strong and vindicated, proud of how I'd stood up for myself and David's memory. Other days I felt hollow, missing David so intensely that all the money and legal victories felt meaningless compared to the simple absence of his morning coffee ritual or his terrible movie commentary. I started seeing a counselor who specialized in complicated grief, the kind that comes with trauma and betrayal layered on top of loss. She helped me understand that I could grieve my marriage while also celebrating my strength, that loving David didn't require forgiving his family's cruelty. Slowly, I began building new traditions and relationships that honored David's memory without being controlled by his family's expectations. I maintained friendships with his genuine friends, the people who had known and supported our relationship. I continued the Thursday farmers market routine, now as a vendor selling apple products from our orchard. I started dating again, carefully and slowly, learning to trust my judgment about people's character. When I eventually met someone new, a fellow widower who understood the complexity of building love on the foundation of loss, I introduced him to David's memory gradually, sharing stories and photos without apology or explanation to anyone else. 2 years after David's death, I received a letter from Patricia. It was brief and formal, expressing regret for any misunderstandings during the estate settlement and requesting permission to visit David's grave, which was on orchard property. I spent a long time considering how to respond. Part of me wanted to refuse, to maintain the boundaries that protected my peace. But another part of me, the part that David had loved about me, recognized that grief and fear had driven Patricia's terrible choices, even if they didn't excuse them. I wrote back granting permission for supervised visits, with clear conditions about behavior and advance notice. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was acknowledgement that David would have wanted his mother to be able to mourn him, even if she'd lost the right to participate in my life. Looking back now, I can see how this experience taught me the difference between family you're born into and family you choose. David's blood relatives tried to erase me because they saw love as a zero-sum game. If David loved me, that somehow diminished his love for them. But the people who became my real family after David's death, his genuine friends, my own support network, the neighbors who helped with harvest, the counselor who guided me through healing, understood that love multiplies when it's real. They showed me that being family isn't about shared DNA or legal documents, it's about choosing to show up for each other, especially when it's difficult. The most important lesson I learned was about trusting my own experience, even when everyone around me was trying to convince me it wasn't valid. Patricia and her accomplices were skilled manipulators who had decades of practice at controlling family narratives. They almost succeeded in making me doubt my own memories of my marriage, my understanding of David's character, and my worth as a person. But somewhere deep inside, I'd known the truth, that David had loved me genuinely, that our marriage had been real and good, and that I deserved better than what they were offering. Learning to hold on to that truth in the face of coordinated gaslighting was perhaps the hardest and most valuable skill I've ever developed. If you're watching this because you recognize something familiar in my story, I want you to know that you're not crazy, you're not ungrateful, and you're not asking for too much when you expect to be treated with basic respect and honesty. Families that operate through manipulation and emotional abuse often make their victims feel like they're the problem, like they're too sensitive or demanding. But healthy relationships don't require you to minimize your own needs or accept being treated as disposable. There are warning signs that I wish I'd recognized earlier, patterns that might help you identify similar dynamics in your own life. Be cautious of family members who speak about you like you're not present, who make decisions that affect you without including you in the conversation, or who consistently forget to invite you to important events. Pay attention to people who use phrases like "that's just how they are" to excuse bad behavior, or who pressure you to keep the peace by accepting treatment you wouldn't tolerate from anyone else. Notice when people make you feel like you have to earn basic respect or constantly prove your loyalty. These aren't quirks or personality differences, they're tactics used by people who see relationships as power struggles rather than partnerships. If you're dealing with estate fraud or family manipulation around inheritance, document everything. Keep copies of all communications, take photos of important documents, and don't rely on verbal promises or informal agreements. Get your own legal representation, even if other family members suggest you don't need it. And remember that challenging unfair treatment isn't selfish or greedy, it's standing up for yourself, and often for the true wishes of the person who died. Most importantly, remember that you have the right to protect yourself from people who hurt you, even if they're family. Blood relationships don't come with unlimited permission to cause harm. Setting boundaries isn't punishment, it's self-care. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in toxic dynamics, even when that means accepting the end of certain relationships. To everyone who has shared their own stories in the comments of my previous videos, thank you for helping me feel less alone in this experience. Your courage in speaking your truth has helped me continue healing and growing. If my story resonates with you, please share where you're watching from and let me know what part felt most familiar. Sometimes just knowing that someone else understands can make all the difference in finding the strength to advocate for yourself. The journey from victim to survivor to advocate isn't linear or simple, but it's possible. You deserve relationships that celebrate your worth rather than diminish it. You deserve to be seen and heard and valued for who you are, not who others want you to become. and you deserve to trust your own experience, even when everyone around you is suggesting you're wrong. Your truth matters, your feelings are valid, and your life is worth protecting, even from people who claim to love you. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe and hit the notification bell to join our community of people who are learning to choose themselves. Together we can support each other in building lives based on genuine love and respect rather than manipulation and fear. Remember, you are not alone. You are not asking for too much, and you deserve so much better than settling for scraps of affection from people who should be celebrating your presence in their lives.